Dr. Walford, can I ask you to look at section or paragraph 47 of your statement? It's on page 128, and I'll put this on screen. Shomek, it's WITN 4461001. And I think it's page 128.
Yes.
So we'll see at paragraph 47.1 the issues that you were asked to describe, the decision-making structures and processes in place and with what oversight during your time at the department to ensure comprehensive assessment of the risks, timely, coordinated and structured decision-making as to the nature and extent of risks, timely, coordinated and structured decision-making as to the steps that should be taken, and then adequate information sharing between officials and ministers. And I just want to pick up on a couple of issues relating to that.
Yes.
So if we look at your next paragraph, you say this: responsibility for the assessment of risks arising from blood and blood products did not rest with any one entity or organisation. And then you listed a number of bodies with responsibility in relation to that matter, excluding the NHS itself, regional health authorities and the like itself. So if we go over the page, we can see that you identify responsibility for risk assessment and monitoring of the safety of blood and blood components resting with the National Blood Transfusion Service and regional transfusion directors. Then in relation to identifying blood-borne infections, that was with the Communicable Disease Surveillance Centre and then the Med IMCD division of the Department of Health. You've then referred to the role of the licensing authority in relation to biological products. You dealt then with the risks to healthcare staff. And then you've identified a range of committees.
Yes.
This is paragraph 47.7, advising the department on risks relating to blood and blood products. You've named some of them there.
Mm-hmm.
And then over the page, top of the next page, you've observed that there was no overarching advisory committee on blood safety, such as the Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood, which was set up some years later to advise the government on blood safety issues. Now, just pausing there, you've recognised that there was no overarching body, and you've identified a number of different bodies, committees, working parties, organisations with a role in relation to this issue. Looking back, do you think it would have been a good idea to have a body such as the Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood at an earlier stage? In other words, one overarching body with responsibility for this issue?
Indubitably. Obviously, it would have been a good thing.
And was it something that you can recall ever being discussed during the period you were involved, so up to the end of 83?
Not at all.
And then you say in the next paragraph this: unless there were an identified hazard with risks to public health which required a national response, the wider department generally did not become involved in decision-making or risk mitigation, as this was best done by the responsible organisation or through the licensing authority. In the event that a hazard was identified with potential national or serious ramifications for the public health, the DHSS would become involved and would work with regional and local public health officials and the PHLS to take the necessary action and offer guidance to the responsible bodies. In such circumstance, ministers would be promptly informed, briefed, submissions provided, and would be asked to take decisions as necessary. Now, I don't know whether it's possible to answer what I'm going to ask you in the abstract or not, but can you assist us with really, when did something that was a matter of clinical practice or a concern about risks of treatment, when did that become a risk of such proportions that it became a public health matter in which the department and the Secretary of State would become involved?
Well, I suppose strictly sticking with blood and blood products, if I can, the area where I think appropriately the Chief Medical Officer would have given advice was once the advisory group on testing for hepatitis B, surface antigen and its antibody, had recommended certain screening programs to be undertaken. And for hepatitis B, remember, all blood was potentially infectious. All blood would potentially transmit hepatitis B, and therefore it was of very wide public health significance. And once there was a way of dealing with it, which was screening for hepatitis B surface antigen and its antibody in the blood system, then it would be perfectly appropriate for an alert to go out, advice to be given to the transfusion authorities, to people who were donating blood and so on, that actually here was a risk, here was what we were doing about it or what could be done about it. And of course, subsequently, there was a hepatitis B vaccine. So areas where actually there is some action that people can take, something that you can do potentially to avoid actually finding infections that could have been avoided, then the Chief Medical Officer would put out appropriate guidance. But remember, I think that you will know that this particular recommendation came from the third meeting of the advisory group on testing for hepatitis B and its antibody. So there had been 3 meetings over a period from about 1973, 74 or something, until the date that the guidance was put out, and then firm recommendations put out as to the screening necessary for the blood and blood products.
Would that suggest, and this again is very much by way of inviting you to give general observations or general reflections, would that suggest that potentially the department was reactive rather than proactive in relation to assessing risk and taking action?
Mm-hmm. I think that, if I may say so, to characterise it as reactive is not appropriate. Essentially, the department had to take advice. It didn't of itself have the capacity to formulate what needed to be done. It needed to rely on the committees that it established in order to do this. So I don't think it's reactive to describe that a report is produced and the department acts on it and acts on it quickly, which it seems to me that they did in that particular instance. I think that's the appropriate reaction, rather than saying it was somehow or other too slow or retrograde in some way.
And then going back to the question of assessment of the risks arising from blood and blood products, again, during the period that you were there, so from 76 through to the end of 83, and leaving aside what happened thereafter because you weren't then involved with blood or blood products for some years, in that period of time, did the department ever have available to it a comprehensive assessment of the risks from blood or blood products?
A comprehensive assessment seems to imply that all the information might have been brought together in a large and compendious document which contained all the possible risks. And the answer to that is, as far as I'm aware, no, it didn't. And knowledge of risks obviously accumulated over time. And essentially, when we sort of start off this period, people were beginning to know about hepatitis B, and then, of course, gradually moving on to non-A, non-B, and then, alas, gradually moving on to AIDS. But that was not knowledge that could have actually been there in a kind of compendium of what we know. There was a huge amount known about the fact that blood transfusion itself carried risks. There was no way, even today, that blood transfusion doesn't carry a risk, however small it may be now because of all the wonderful screening that can be done. But there is always a risk inherently in having foreign material from some other person introduced into the body of another person. There is always a risk.
And what you described in that section of your statement could be said to be a somewhat fragmented system, multiple organisations, bodies,
yes.
Involved in assessing different aspects,
yes.
and taking decisions or making recommendations on different aspects of risk and how to mitigate risk. Do you see disadvantages or downsides to that? And if so, what were they?
Well, there are disadvantages, and if you're particularly looking at blood transfusion, I mean, what has evolved over time, apart from the Virological Safety of Blood Committee, which was something obviously would have been wonderful to have had it at the time that I was there, but we didn't. But then there is a really important system of what's called hemovigilance, which the National Blood Transfusion Service now operates, which is called SHOT, the SHOT system, which is the serious hazards of transfusion. And that really monitors everything very, very closely. That's the sort of thing that we could have done with, but we didn't have it.
And then I just want to pick up on, again, as a matter for general exploration at this stage, the role of ministers. First of all, I think the various ministers involved with blood products in relation to the years that you were there were Dr. Vaughan, Mr. Finsberg, Lord Glenarthur, now Lord Clark, then Mr. Clark, and now Lord Fowler, then Mr. Fowler. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you recall whether you yourself had direct meetings with any of those ministers?
While I was in Med-SEB, really very few. I was too junior, in effect. So I often provided material for briefing, but I didn't have very many face-to-face meetings. I did accompany, it's obvious from the papers, I accompanied Mr. Finsberg, I think, and possibly Dr. Vaughan as well, I don't recall, to BPL as part of a bag-carrying contingent, but very rarely was I actually briefing ministers face-to-face. And
who was it who would decide that a matter needed to go to the minister? Submission needed to be made, the minister needed to be either informed of something or asked to take a decision?
In general, it would be the administrative divisions.
And at what level would that kind of decision be taken?
The decision would actually be sitting between the grade 5, who was called an assistant secretary in those days, and the grade 3, the undersecretary. So taking some of the BPL material, it would be Mr. Harley as the grade 5, the assistant secretary, and Mr. Wormhold, the grade 3, the undersecretary.
And were you aware of any, as it were, yardstick or criteria by which those in the administrative division would decide this is a matter that has to go to the minister, this one doesn't?
No, it was a rather arcane art, actually, from my perspective, because as I mentioned, we didn't receive any training when we came into I came into a policy division, if you like, the Med-SEB, and I have no recollection of being trained in that or even understanding what a PQ was, or all this I learned on the job. I didn't know. And it just seemed to me to be natural that, okay, they decided something was going to go. Now, obviously, there could be pressure from the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, for example, as there was on a number of occasions, because he was chairing some very important committees. But then that would be him saying to administrative colleagues, this needs to go up to ministers, but not, by and large, not presenting it himself.
Now, your statement, I think, is largely addressing decision-making affecting England and Wales.
Yes.
Can you recall whether you had any interactions or any significant interactions with the Scottish office or the Scottish Home and Health Department?
Yes, I wouldn't call them significant interactions, but I did interact on occasion. In fact, I went up to visit my counterpart in Scotland, Dr. Bell, and one remembers some of these things because they stand out, and I remember that he gave me my first taste of haggis. So, yes, I remember that trip, and basically we exchanged information. But I didn't often deal with Scotland, in fact, very rarely, except to receive information that they may want to convey. But essentially, the Scottish Home and Health Department, through its Common Services Agency, ran their Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service, and they had their own protein fractionation laboratory at Liberton, and so they were pretty self-sufficient when it came to matters to do with blood and blood products.
So decisions affecting Scotland on the areas in which you were most closely involved were largely taken within Scotland, to your knowledge?
Yes.
Other than, as it were, you liaising with Dr. Bell, for example, were there any more formal measures in place, either at your level or at a more senior level, to ensure that there was consistency of medical advice, for example, being provided both in Scotland and England and Wales?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know that I would necessarily have been aware of whether there was consistency or not, because I might not have known what was going on in Scotland. The only area where I am sure that the same document went out was on the leaflet for donors, which, having been developed in the English system, nevertheless based on one that had been worked on in Scotland, it was decided that that donor leaflet should be actually a UK leaflet. It should be used by both Scotland and, of course, England and Wales, but that each part of the country would put out its own press release describing what was in the leaflet, and that's what happened. But for anything else, I simply don't know.
And then what about the position in relation to Northern Ireland? Well, we see in the documents occasional references to issues about plasma and arrangements being made between Northern Ireland and Liberton for the fractionation of plasma collected in Northern Ireland and so on. But in terms of the areas of policy that you were feeding into and the decisions that were then being taken through the administrative branch in relation to blood and blood products, what role did Northern Ireland and the provision of products in Northern Ireland play?
Well, I'm ashamed to say I probably never actually thought about Northern Ireland. It wasn't my area of responsibility. The only thing, looking back at the papers, that I find is that at some stage a decision was taken that Liberton should do the fractionation for Northern Ireland. So it was a Scottish decision and it was dealing with Northern Ireland. But other than that, I was not involved at all.
And so did you have any of the equivalent interactions you've described with Dr. Bell? Did you have any interactions with the Northern Ireland office or any officials relating to Northern Ireland?
I'm not aware. I think they may have come to a joint meeting. There was one joint meeting where I think officials from Northern Ireland were there, but I have no recollection of any interaction with them at that meeting.
And then in relation to Wales, although, as I understand it, the decisions that were being taken that you fed into largely affected England and Wales.
Yes.
We see, for example, Welsh office representation, again, at some meetings. Do you recall any particular interactions with civil servants in the Welsh office?
No.
Can I turn then to the relationship between the department and your own relationship with UKHCDO as the next topic?
Yes.
Before we look at a handful of documents, what was your understanding when you took up your post in Med-SEB about the extent to which concentrates or cryoprecipitate were a regular part of the treatment of haemophiliacs in the UK?
Well, I think from my time in the blood transfusion service and my time in the medicines division, where concentrates were obviously an issue, there were products which would have gone for licensing, and my time with the medicines inspectorate and so on, I was well aware that both cryo and factor VIII concentrates were used in the treatment of haemophilia.
And what about home treatment and prophylactic treatment? Did you have any understanding of the extent to which those were part and parcel of the clinical care of patients with bleeding disorders?
I'm just trying to think when I might have become aware of it in terms of sort of dates, because that gradually increased. And I couldn't be certain exactly, I can't identify exactly the time, but certainly by the time I was in Med-SEB and talking to the UKHCDO, I was well aware that they were getting more and more into home therapy with concentrates, and as time went on, prophylactic therapy with concentrates. Not everywhere, but that was available as during my time in Med-SEB.
And by the time you were in Med-SEB and in that sort of 4-year period, 79 to 83, would UKHCDO have been, or the reference centre directors have been, the primary source of your information about how haemophiliacs were treated?
Absolutely.
do you recall being aware of DDAVP and the aware of the extent to which that was being used?
Not the extent to which it was being used, but I recall the various discussions in the UK HCDO meetings where it was always very... Once DDAVP was actually discovered, if you will, and its effect on releasing factor VIII from endothelial cells in the patient, it became definitely a part of the therapeutic armamentarium of directors or haemophilius and treaters to use that for von Willebrand's disease, to use it for mild haemophiliacs. In other words, to avoid using factor VIII concentrate. But it really needed to be in a mild haemophiliac so that it can actually produce the factor VIII level that you need to stop the bleeding. But it was definitely their policy, as far as I can recall, to use it as appropriate for such patients.
And would it be right to understand that the use of DDAVP was something which the department itself did not become involved in? It was regarded as part of that clinical freedom that you've described?
Yes, because the department, again, I would say, never became involved in what treatment was administered to what patient in any area. Heart disease, gastrointestinal disease, we didn't become involved.
And so would the same be true in relation to then the approach to treating children or the approach to treating mild haemophiliacs more generally? That would be regarded as something for haemophilia clinicians under the auspices of UK HCDO to formulate their own policies?
Yes.
Now, in your capacity as Principal Medical Officer at MedSEB, you sometimes attended the annual general meetings, I think, of UK HCDO.
Yes.
And I think, looking at the documents, you attended in November 1979, which would have been your first... Was that your first attendance, probably?
It should have been, yes.
And then you attended the next one the year later in September 1980. I just want to look at that really just to kind of get a flavour of UK HCDO meetings. So it's PRSE 303946, please, Shomik.
Do you by any chance have a number for my statement?
It's not referred to in your statement. It's one of the additional documents that you were provided with, Dr. Walford. So so we can see the date there. It's at Glasgow, 30th of September 1980. The chair is Professor Bloom. There's a list of apologies for attendance of those who are not present, so we won't look at that. If we then go, and I really want to get a sense of how the meetings work from your perspective. That's the purpose of going to this. So if we go to page 4, please, Shomik. We look at the bottom of the page. There's a heading, Report on the 1979 Annual Returns from Haemophilia Centres. And then there's a reference to Dr. Ritzer presenting a report on the annual returns. And then there's a long discussion about essentially what they show and issues about self-sufficiency and commercial concentrates and so on. You were there and present. We see you interjecting from time to time. Would you, as far as you can recall, get these reports on the annual returns in advance of these meetings?
Oh, no, not in advance of the meeting. Whether we got them afterwards as part of the minutes, I don't know, but certainly not in advance.
But you would get them in at some point?
We might, but it depends. Basically, if they were appended to the minutes, yes. If not, no.
And then if we just go over the page, there's a long discussion recorded about product usage, and I just want to pick it up about 6 or 7 lines down. No, actually, I'll pick it up 5 lines down. It says, Dr. Ritzer said there appeared to be total inconsistency between the usage in various regions. Professor Stewart said there were difficulties about getting any material at all. Regional health authorities were reluctant to pay for commercial materials. And then 2 or 3 lines further down, it says, Professor Stewart said he was worried about the increasing usage of commercial factor VIII. He suggested that the Department of Health should look into the question of licensing a commercial firm or firms to make NHS material. Dr. Diana Walford said the Department of Health at the moment was actively discussing this question. and then the discussion continues. Now, I'm not really asking you about the detail of the discussion, but I just wanted to get a sense of how the meetings and the discussions worked from your perspective. These minutes record you actively contributing to the discussion. Was that generally how the meetings ran?
Well, I certainly spoke up if I ever felt I needed to. I mean, essentially, it was their meetings, but if I knew something that I felt they needed to know, or they'd raised an issue to which I knew the answer, as for example in this case, then I would say so. There was no bar to my speaking up, although I was an observer and it was their meeting. I wasn't particularly slow in coming forward.
And then if we just go on to page 9, please, Shomik. We can see halfway down the page it says reports from Working Party chairmen, and the first is a report from the Hepatitis Working Party chair, who was Dr. Krask, and he refers to presenting a short written report and describing the findings of the Working Party and future plans. Now, you've referred to Dr. Krask and his reports being a valuable source of information for you. Would it be right to understand that those reports at least did find their way to you generally?
Yes, generally, and later, though. We basically, as far as I can see from the papers, I sometimes received the reports quite a few months after they had already been discussed. Obviously, if we were discussing, or he was presenting in the meeting, he often presented fact findings, and so it would be up on a screen or whatever it was. Well, I would be looking at that, but I wouldn't necessarily have the actual report.
And then if we go over the page, the bottom of the next page refers to the Home Treatment Working Party. It records Dr. Jones giving a verbal report. So would this be, the kind of source of information about the prevalence of home treatment that you would have?
Yes.
And then if we turn to just the last page, maybe a stretch to ask you to remember this because it's obviously over 40 years ago, but we can see that this meeting took place in Glasgow, and we can see there's a reference to the meeting closing and followed by a 1.5-day symposium entitled Unresolved Problems in Haemophilia, organised by Dr. Forbes, the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow, and sponsored by Travenol. Do you recall whether you attended that symposium?
I was trying to remember because obviously I saw that had happened, and I've actually seen a paper from the symposium. But unless you've got my name down as having attended, then I don't know whether I attended or not.
We don't have a list of attendees.
No,
so.
I'm sorry, I can't say.
So that's you attended the annual general meeting in 1979, 1980. You attended the 1981 meeting. I'm not going to take you to that. The 1982 annual general meeting took place when I think you were on maternity leave. Would you have expected someone to attend in your place from the department? So there's no sign from the minutes that they did.
I mean, possibly. It depended how my stand-in chose to operate. I don't know whether she did or she didn't. Or even whether she may have known about the meeting because if papers came through to my desk. I'm not sure how she would necessarily have known. I hope somebody would have passed stuff to her, but I can't be sure.
And you didn't attend the October 1983 annual meeting, although you did attend Reference Centre Director meeting just before that, or the month before that. When you didn't attend, what was the kind of time frame before which you would then get the minutes and copies of any reports?
Really long. So it was just not a system that worked terribly efficiently, so it wasn't that we had the meeting and then a few days later along come the minutes. It took, often I think, from recollection, I saw the minutes for the first time, the draft minutes, if you will, at the next meeting. They obviously didn't consult the department on what was going in the draft minutes. The chair of the meeting would have dealt with those.
So we've seen correspondence from Dr. Ritzer often at this time sending out copies of the draft minutes and asking for comments. As far as you can recall, those didn't get sent to you?
No.
And then, is this right? You didn't routinely attend the reference centre director meetings, but you did attend some of them specifically either because you asked to or you were asked to.
Yes, it was not considered to be appropriate for departmental observers, if you will, to go to the reference centre directors' meetings. Essentially, they were their private meetings, and officials didn't go.
And so when you say not considered appropriate, do you mean not considered appropriate by the reference centre directors?
Yes.
We will look, when we look at AIDS tomorrow, at a couple of the meetings in 1983 that you attended, but one of which was a reference centre director meeting on the 19th of September 1983. I don't want to look at those minutes now, but I want to look at an exchange of correspondence between Dr. Jones and Professor Bloom after that meeting, just to invite really your comment. So if we could have OXUH 40882, please. So this is a letter from Dr. Peter Jones from the Royal Infirmary in Newcastle, the Newcastle Haemophilia Centre, 13th of October 1983 to Professor Bloom. And it refers in the first paragraph to the last meeting of reference centre directors. You asked us to write in with our views about centralised purchasing. Now, just pausing there, the idea, as I understand it, and it was an idea that you brought up at the reference centre directors meeting, was that rather than haemophilia centres purchasing their own commercial products, it would all be done centrally.
Yes, this wasn't an idea of my own. This was something that had been brought up and had been in discussion in the various meetings on the National Blood Transfusion Centre's service for a long time. I think it was first talked about in 1979 in one of their meetings. I noticed that. Essentially, there was a significant worry that material was being purchased, and it was being purchased by individual haemophilia centres, and it was also being written up in prescriptions by general practitioners, and it was also finding its way into hospitals that weren't haemophilia centres, not even associate haemophilia centres. So there was a real sense that, well, actually, where's it all going? We simply don't have a handle on that. And that didn't make sense to the National Blood Transfusion Service, who felt that the handle was necessary for safety reasons. And so this idea kept emerging, if I can put it that way. And it was obviously, at that time, something that had bubbled up to the surface again. And in particular, of course, it turned out, and I can't remember whether it was at this meeting or some other meeting, must have been probably another meeting later on, I'm not sure what the date of this meeting was, that it was discovered that some of the factor VIII concentrate that had actually been used to treat the unfortunate man in Bristol who had succumbed, unfortunately, he was the first case to succumb to AIDS, had actually found its way into other hospitals, but nobody could trace it. And that seemed to be a major safety problem, and that we really shouldn't happen, and it could be avoided by making the NBTS responsible for keeping records of wherever the material went. So that was the object.
And I think we'll see if we look further down this letter. It certainly didn't go down very well with Dr. Peter Jones. Mm-hmm. So if we see the third paragraph, however, if the new scheme means that firms are going to be asked to tender for the market on a purely financial basis, I'm very frightened this will lead to restrictions on our prescribing rights. There are two things to which I'm totally opposed. Firstly, that my choice of product for prescription to any particular patient should be affected in any way, regardless of cost. Secondly, that any authority, be it the DHSS or the Blood Transfusion Service, should have any control over my clinical responsibility for my patients. Is that what you are talking about when you talk about the clinicians jealously guarding their clinical fields?
Yes, and what's more, though, that it was really horribly misguided, because nobody was intending to interfere with anybody's prescription. People were free to prescribe. It was just keeping tabs on what was being prescribed. And I think the inquiry has given me a paper where I looked at this rather ruefully, really, where I wrote a report, whether it was from this meeting or not, I don't recall, but I wrote a report about how the concept of the regional transfusion centres holding the material and having it, as it were, controlled in that way, had been the subject of almost willful misunderstanding by the haemophilia centre directors. They really didn't want to accept that there was a genuine issue here, a safety issue. They wanted to be able, they felt that we were going to, in some way, circumscribe their ability to prescribe, and that was never the intention. And it was a sort of travesty of what we were trying to do.
And if we go to the second page, please, we can see Dr. Jones says this: although I have the greatest respect for her, I was very disturbed to find Diana Walford at the last reference centre directors meeting without prior consultation, and hope that this will not happen again. Of course, I would have no objection to her being invited for a specific topic such as AIDS, but I do think that it is impossible to discuss matters of concern relating to our patients in front of outsiders, particularly when they represent authority. From remarks passed at the meeting, it would appear that the new proposals for centralised purchasing are dictated by financial concerns and not in the best interests of our patients. Leaving aside that last sentence for the moment, or for present purposes, this appears to characterise you and the Department of Health as an outsider representing authority. Was that the sense you got when you attended these meetings, that was how you were perceived?
I don't think I saw it quite as starkly as this, but if you turn up and say, I'm from the ministry, I'm here to help, it's not usually particularly well received. Essentially, I think our presence was tolerated. It was sometimes found helpful, but other times I think people might have felt that it inhibited their free discussion, which might well have included criticism of the department. But in general, I didn't feel as if I was going into the lion's den, but I was conscious of the fact that I was an outsider and I was there to a degree on sufferance. These were private meetings.
And if we just look at the response from Professor Bloom, it's OXUH 40892. We can see in the second paragraph, Professor Bloom says, I take your point about Diana Walford. To be fair with her, she did ask me beforehand if she could join our last meeting. And in fact, had she not been there, we would not have had this prior warning of the possible intention of the health departments regarding Factor VIII purchasing. It is also extremely useful that Diana is sympathetic to the haemophilia organisations. Now, that's Professor Bloom's comment, but do you have any sense of what he meant by that?
Well, I don't know exactly what he meant, but it's fair to say I had a really strong feeling of sympathy towards the haemophiliac population because I sort of knew stuff about what they were going through.
And then it continues, nevertheless, I appreciate she's a shrewd cookie and perhaps it will be more circumspect in the future to invite her just for specific items on the agenda if indicated. So it sounds as though the plan going forward, and you then moved to a different job, but the plan going forward was for you to only come to reference centre director meetings for specific items rather than general attendance.
It looks like it would have been, I don't know whether it was the case, that my successor, Dr. Alison Smithies, would have been invited if necessary for specific matters and not necessarily for the entirety of the meeting.
Do you read the sense of the description of you as a shrewd cookie? And perhaps it was more circumspect to invite you just for specific items, that this was a way of saying that you were a spy in the camp?
Yes, I suppose it does, actually. I didn't mind being called a shrewd cookie, actually. Now I've seen it.
I doubt people would, but the sense of it seems to be the spy in the camp.
I think that's right. Basically, I think they were concerned that they would have a discussion which inappropriately I would bring back to the department with my own interpretation of what the issue was, and that might not always be helpful.
Now, if we can just go back to your statement, showing that it's WITN 4461001, page 125, please. It's paragraph 44.4, Dr. Walford. And this is still in relation to UKHCDO.
Paragraph
44.4.
Okay, yes.
So you've said there that the UKHCDO represented for the DHSS the group with relevant expertise in a rare disease which consumed a very significant resource in terms of the activities of the BPL and the NBTS, as well as of the budgets of RHAs in terms of the provision of hospital and rehabilitation and other services for haemophiliacs and the need to purchase commercial concentrates. Just want to focus on the first line or so there. UKHCDO represented the group with relevant expertise in haemophilia and related bleeding disorders. So, again, really building on that and what you've said already, is it right to understand that on questions of treatment, risks and benefits of different types of treatment, how to strike the balance in terms of risks, would the DHSS very much be guided by and defer to what UKHCDO's views were?
Completely.
At the meetings which you attended, was there, whether it's reference centre directors or the annual general meetings, was there a dominant voice or voices?
At UKHCDO?
Yes, in terms of individual clinicians.
Well, that should appear in the minutes if it doesn't. If you're asking me possibly whether Professor Bloom dominated the conversations, which I suspect you might be asking me, I think sometimes he did and sometimes he didn't. I think there was quite a free flow of information between the different directors, as I recall.
Professor Bloom was obviously chair of UKHCDO, and as we'll see as we look in more detail, perhaps later today, probably tomorrow, at some of the underlying documents, he was then involved in a multiplicity of other meetings, organisations, interactions with the Department of Health. Again, we'll see when we look at AIDS tomorrow. He's the person you write to or have telephone conversations with in early '83 as AIDS becomes a pressing issue. Looking back, do you think the department was too reliant upon the voice and views of what was ultimately one individual clinician, in other words, Professor Bloom?
He ought to have been able to represent to us the views, insofar as they were aggregatable, of the UK Haemophilia Centre directors. He should have been able, and we had no reason to suppose he wasn't able, to take the temperature of any given meeting or to deal with a particular policy. We did rely upon him, just as we would have relied upon the chair of the National Blood Transfusion, the Regional Transfusion Directors meeting, to represent the views of, if you like, the body of membership of their committees. And essentially, we would have relied upon him to do that to the best of his ability, and not to put a particular individual spin that wasn't held by other members of the UKHCDO.
Would it be right to say that you'd have no way of knowing, either at the time or probably now, whether what he was doing was, as it were, conveying his own view, or whether he was more broadly representing the views of others?
Well, only from the meetings I attended, and obviously I could hear what other people were saying. I don't recall particular dissent in those. I mean, there were obviously some issues were picked up. There was various discussion, but it didn't seem as if these were very sort of vociferous meetings. It wasn't that people were disagreeing vehemently. On the whole, I think they were vehemently agreeing.
Did you or any of your colleagues in the department, your medical colleagues, ever think of challenging or interrogating what was being said to you about the way haemophilia clinicians thought the matters should be conducted?
Well, when I was in the meetings, I mean, there were breaks and I talked to people. I don't particularly remember any kind of what I would call a significant difference of view that I was putting across. Obviously, yes, on organisational matters, that didn't go down well. But in terms of clinical matters, it would not have been A, appropriate, B, nor did I have the expertise, and nor did I, as far as I can remember, actually intervene.
Well, I may want to pick that up as a theme when we look at documents relating to AIDS again tomorrow. Other than through your attendance at those meetings, and then your attendance, and we'll look at some of the minutes, at other meetings at which Professor Bloom might be present, or sometimes Dr. Krask was present.
Yes.
Were there other individual clinicians, either in relation to haemophilia care, or virology, or transfusion, that you had regular dealings with?
Regular dealings? No. I mean, obviously, I saw in different fora different people. So, Dr. Ari Zuckerman, Professor Ari Zuckerman, in terms of research, certainly I saw him on a number of occasions. You've referred me to a meeting which I had with Dr. Tedder, a virologist, and Dr. Mortimer, a virologist, whom I came to know very well when I was in the PHLS. But particularly, I'm trying to think if there were any specific individuals to whom I would turn. Of course, Dr. Gunson, and then, needless to say, on BPL and so on, and on fractionation, it was Dr. Lane.
Then can I ask you to look at a particular document? It's minutes of a meeting of the Hepatitis Working Party. You weren't present, but you're referred to. So it's HCDO 40546. So you'll see, Dr. Walford, it's the minutes of the third meeting of UKHCDO's Hepatitis Working Party, November the 7th, and it's 1978, although the date doesn't appear from that. Could we go to the top of the second page? So this is whilst you're still in the medicines division.
Oh, right.
Under the heading Study of NHS Factor 8, the first paragraph, top of the page, says, Dr. Krask said this would be assessed after 1 year. Dr. Ellis said he would like a more definite procedure for the investigation of cases of hepatitis and a clearer definition of factor 8-associated hepatitis. Dr. Krask agreed to discuss this with Dr. Lane and Dr. Walford of the Medicines Commission. And then there's a discussion in the next paragraph about what would happen when a batch of factor 8 was known to be contaminated with hepatitis B. Are you able to assist us in understanding any more what the first paragraph is referring to, and why Dr. Krask was envisaging he would have a discussion with you about this issue?
Well, I don't. By the way, I didn't attend the UKHCDO Hepatitis Working Party. I was not invited. This was, of course, before I was in Med-SEB. This was when I was in the Medicines Division. Now, my role in Medicines Division was the licensing of blood products, if you like, and essentially it sounds as if Dr. Krask wanted to talk to me and Dr. Lane about products which might be known to be associated with hepatitis. This is probably going to be hepatitis B. Now, by then you could actually diagnose that. You could know that that product was associated because you would have found the agent, if you like, in the product or maybe in the recipients. But it's most likely at this point, which must be, 78?
November 78.
Then it's most likely to be hepatitis B.
But you've no specific recollection of...
None at all.
Of discussing this?
No.
And then if we go to the next page, top of the next page, this doesn't refer to you by name, but it under the heading Super Regional Directors Meeting, it says in the second line, the DHSS Small Grants Committee had requested that the directors consider whether patients might be kept on one batch or a single product for some time, as this might reduce the incidence of transfusion hepatitis. And then it goes on to set out what the director's opinion was. First of all, can you assist us with what the department's Small Grants Committee was?
As far as I can recall, it was a committee set up to administer some small, and it was small, grants to people wanting to do particular research. It is possible, I don't know for sure, that Dr. Krask's surveillance of hepatitis, the Hepatitis Working Party's surveillance, which he chaired, was funded from the Small Grants Committee. I don't know, but that sounds as if it could have been.
And we see there reference to a possible approach of patients being kept on a single product or a single batch. The inquiries heard evidence that some clinicians adopted that approach and for safety reasons, and some clinicians, perhaps the majority of clinicians, did not. Do you recall that ever coming up in discussions within the Department of Health, that kind of approach?
No, I don't remember.
And then just on the Small Grants Committee, it might just help join the pieces, or join the dots. If we go to DHSC 301121. This is a minute authored by you. We can see your name at the bottom of the page. And then a handwritten date, December 1980. And we can see you're now in Med SEB. And then if we go to the top of the page, it's entitled Studies of the Epidemiology and Chronic Sequelae of Factor 8 and 9 Associated Hepatitis in the United Kingdom. And then you refer to not having you refer to a project number, to not having inherited a file on the project from Dr. Waiter, who was your predecessor. You've referred to talks being delivered by Dr. Krask, and it records there it's generally acknowledged that Dr. Krask et al. Are performing a valuable and necessary study. And then it says the study has one more year to run. I would have no hesitation in supporting it. I see that Dr. Krask is proposing to make an application to the Small Grants Committee to study whether patients with mild coagulation defects with minimal previous exposure to blood products should be treated with special coagulation concentrates made from a small pool of donors to minimise the risk of hepatitis in this susceptible group. I would certainly endorse such a project. And then you talk in the next paragraph about a valuable spin-off from Dr. Krask's research was documentation on the type, quantity and source of factor VIII administered to haemophiliacs is now much more accurately known. So if we just stick with that first paragraph that's on the screen and the reference to the application to the Small Grants Committee, do you know whether the application there described was made, and if so, what the outcome was?
No, I don't know. Well, I don't know whether it was made. I mean, this seems to be maybe simply a continuation for another year of Dr. Krask's funding by the department to do, because although it was an HCDO working party, the department actually was providing it as a research funding, research fund grant, if you will. His continued surveillance went on for another year. Whether he actually did this particular bit of research, which would have been extremely valuable had he done it, I don't know. I don't know if the inquiry has any information on this.
Not that I'm presently aware of. It might be said that patients with mild coagulation defects with minimal previous exposure to blood products shouldn't be being treated with concentrates at all, even if they are concentrates made from a smaller pool than the commercial concentrates, or indeed the standard Elstree concentrate.
Well, as a matter of general practice, I would say yes. They shouldn't. They could actually have cryo or DDAVP as necessary. But if you had a serious operation needed, if there was likely to be a lot of blood loss, if there was trauma or whatever, for whatever reason, then although mild haemophiliacs did not actually bleed spontaneously or in general did not, faced with a significant trauma or assault, if you like, on the body, then they could. So if you needed to use concentrate, then it would be far more convenient to use a freeze-dried product because it's given in so much smaller a volume. But also, if you make it from a small pool of donors, then essentially you're getting to the same point that you might be getting to with cryoprecipitate, because if you have to use 20 bags of cryoprecipitate, that's 20 donors, if you like, you could have a small pool, if this research showed that you could do it, a small donor pool, which would be another way of administering a relatively low-risk product.
We can take that down, thank you, Shemik. More broadly, and leaving aside those couple of examples about the DHSS's Small Grants Committee, are you able to assist us with what role the department played in directing or monitoring or funding medical research or observational medical studies relevant to blood and blood products?
Well, the department did fund a small number of projects. It depended how fundamental the research was. There was a sort of concordat between the Medical Research Council and the department. So the more fundamental the research, the more likely the Medical Research Council would be to be the funder. For more operational work, such as Dr. Krask's committee, his working group, that would fall more likely into our camp.
Now, I want to ask you next about your own knowledge of risks of hepatitis, and then more broadly what you think the understanding or awareness might have been within the department. You've said in your statement that as a haematologist,
Yes.
trained in blood transfusion, risks of infection was something that was a fundamental part of your training.
That's right.
But you've pointed us to two publications that you authored as being
Yes.
an illustration of the state of your knowledge at the time they were written. And so I just
Yes.
wanted to look at those because we haven't looked at them yet in inquiry hearings. So the first is WITN 4461002. And we can see the extract that you've provided to us. It's reprinted from Myler's Side Effects of Drugs, 9th edition. A Google search suggests that this was published at the beginning of 1980. I don't know if
I think that's
or
right,
not.
yes.
Can you just assist us, first of all, what's the purpose of this publication?
Well, when I was still in the medicines division, I was approached by the publishers Excerpta Medica and asked, I was never quite sure why I had been fingered for this task, but I was asked if I would be prepared to review a series of papers on blood and blood products, including risks from hepatitis, for Myler's Side Effects of Drugs, the 9th edition. This was a reference work which was in medical libraries. It was placed in medical libraries. They, at the same time, asked me if I would also write an article, or rather a review piece, in the Side Effects of Drugs Annual, number 4, I think, for that year. So I thought it would be a good idea, actually, to do that, a good exercise for me, and not unhelpful to my CV, I thought at the time, to do this work. So I did, and basically they provided me with a significant tranche of publications, and they gave me the hard copies to review, and they only wanted me to focus on what was in the papers that they gave me to review, and I duly did.
And was this publication, Myler's Side Effects of Drugs, you've said it would be in medical libraries, so it was for clinicians or for clinical investigators?
Everybody, really. Medical libraries, essentially, it was deemed to be a reference document. It's still, as far as I know, it's ongoing. It's just one of those publications which is used as a reference work for people who are studying a particular subject.
If we go to the third page, please, Shomik. we can see the chapter which your name and a co-author's name appears at the top, blood and blood products. And then the first paragraph says the transfusion of whole blood or blood products into man may be associated with a variety of adverse reactions. The presentation adopted in this chapter classifies these effects according to the blood component involved, and you give examples. And so it encompasses a number of different adverse reactions. But if we go to what is of interest to the inquiry, which I think is probably page 16 electronically, Shomik. That's it. So bottom right-hand corner, transmission of disease by blood products. Many viral, bacterial and protozoal diseases can be transferred from the donor to the recipient with transfused blood or blood products. Some of these complications will be discussed below. Then you have a heading, hepatitis. Post-transfusion hepatitis may result from the transmission of several viruses, namely hepatitis A, hepatitis B, non-A, non-B viruses, cytomegalovirus and the Epstein-Barr virus. And then if we go to the next page, we can then see, I'm going to skate over hepatitis A, but there's then a discussion about hepatitis B. It talks about how prior to the introduction of sensitive methods for the detection of the hepatitis B antigen, about 30% of cases of post-transfusion hepatitis were caused by hepatitis B virus. And then there's a discussion, I'm not going to go through it in detail, about how that figure has been reduced and the value of the screening test. If we go to the next column, so the same page but the right-hand column, and pick it up just a little higher than that, please. Thanks. So about 6 lines down, it says, despite the introduction of systematic screening, the risk of post-transfusion hepatitis B virus infection remains greater for certain pooled plasma derivatives than for single donations. Plasma fractions such as fibrinogen, antihemophiliac factor, and prothrombin complex concentrates are associated with a high risk of HBV infection. And you then go on to say that partly this high infectivity may be explained by the fact that these fractions are often prepared from paid donor plasma, in which the incidence of positivity is 10 times that in plasma from a non-commercial source. And then, again, I'm not going to go through the detail of the rest of what you say about hepatitis B, but you discuss the hepatitis B. We go over the page. We have a heading non-A, non-B hepatitis. In the USA at present, some 60 to 90% of the post-transfusion hepatitis is unrelated to either hepatitis A or hepatitis B. Neither cytomegalovirus nor the Epstein-Barr virus have been implicated in such cases. At least one additional human hepatitis virus is suspected. Recently, 3 studies have provided convincing evidence for a transmissible agent of non-A, non-B hepatitis. And then you refer to 3 studies, one of volunteers who developed non-A, non-B after inoculation of stored sera from donors. And then the other 2 studies, non-A, non-B hepatitis was transmitted from infected human sera to chimpanzees. And then it goes on to say the latter studies also confirmed the existence of a chronic carrier state in humans. And then a couple of lines further down, further confirmation of the chronic carrier state has come from a follow-up of 44 patients with proven non-A, non-B hepatitis. And then if we just look at the paragraph below that, picking it up halfway down, so it's the paragraph, thank you, halfway down, you refer to Nodell's series. You refer then to a striking difference in the frequency of chronic liver disease in relation to patients who'd received prophylactic immunoglobulin. So just pausing there, I've looked at that not really because I necessarily have a specific question for you about it, Dr. Walford, but because we haven't looked at it before. But as you say in your statement, this can fairly be said to represent part, at least, of your knowledge at the point in time at which you wrote this, which is before you moved to Med-SEB.
Yes, I think there's even more in the side effects of annual.
So if we go to that second publication, WITN 4461003, and we go to the third page, I think, Shomik. If we zoom in, thank you. So you say in the first paragraph, as refinements in the techniques of serology, blood banking and plasma fractionation have widened the scope and scale of therapy with blood and blood products, so attention has been focused increasingly on the problem of post-transfusion hepatitis and its possible progression to chronic liver disease. And then you refer to data from the United States, 20 to 30,000 cases of post-transfusion hepatitis and a death rate from this cause alone of 3,000 per annum. If we then go back to the full page, there's then under the heading hepatitis, you say this year's literature has had two main themes. So just pausing there. Again, do we understand you've been asked to review specific pieces of literature for the purpose of producing this?
Yes.
And we can see the two themes are additional screening tests for hepatitis B virus infectivity and the severity of non-A, non-B hepatitis and its progression to chronic liver disease. And it's just the latter theme I want to look at for present purposes. So if we go to the next page, please, Shomik. The one after. We can see halfway down the page, left-hand column, there's a heading, Severity of non-A, non-B hepatitis and Progression to Chronic Liver Disease. You say, hitherto direct evidence for the transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis by blood products has been lacking. And then you refer to a paper by Wyke et al. Demonstrating the transmission to chimpanzees of an agent responsible for 2 fatal cases and 1 non-fatal case of non-A, non-B hepatitis in patients with liver disease who'd received the same batch of commercial prothrombin complex concentrate prior to liver biopsy. A further death, apparently from non-A, non-B hepatitis, occurred in the series of 17 patients with liver disease who received 4 different batches of concentrates. And then you say these well-documented cases underline the potential severity of this form of hepatitis in patients with pre-existing liver disease. And then you deal specifically with the question of using prothrombin complex concentrates. And then, very bottom of the page, you say the need to limit, go to the top of the next page, the non-essential exposure to coagulation factor concentrates is reinforced by reports that non-A, non-B hepatitis may progress to chronic liver disease. In one of these reports, histologically verified non-A, non-B hepatitis was shown to progress both histologically and clinically to chronic active hepatitis within a 2-year period. Now, I'm not proposing to go to the detail of the reports, but you footnoted in this chapter we see the various different studies and reports. So you would have read all of those at that time for the purpose of producing this.
Yes.
So would it be right to say then that throughout the period of time that you were at Med-SEB, so from the end of 1979 through to the end of 1983, you would have known, you knew that the transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis was through blood products and blood was a significant problem?
Yes.
And you knew also that non-A, non-B hepatitis had at least the potential to have serious consequences in terms of chronic liver disease?
Yes.
Thank you. So I note the time. I think the next document I want to look at might take a little while, so might be a good point at which to break.
Yes, just one question I would like to ask, if I may. One of the earlier papers, which is mentioned in Myler's book by you, one of the presumably coming from a study you'd reviewed, talked about hepatitis B having represented 30% of post-transfusion hepatitis. Now, plainly, until hepatitis B was identified, the only means of saying that a disease was hepatitis B was clinical in some way.
Yes.
What did you understand the 30% figure to be based upon? A sort of retrospective analysis? And if so, what was the other 70%? And when was the other 70%, the missing 70%, which wasn't B,
where were they? Yes.
first known? Do you know? Can you help?
Obviously I can't say, but basically the figures that I was quoting were quoted from the literature. I mean, there were more causes of hepatitis than hepatitis B known at the time. I've mentioned a few of them. Actually, some of them gave mild hepatitis. You might have cytomegalovirus, you might have Epstein-Barr virus. And of course, everything was to a degree complicated by whether there was any pre-existing liver disease in individuals, which might be simply for reasons of alcohol ingestion and so on. So I can't actually tell you what now. I might have been able to tell you earlier on when I wrote this, but basically I cannot say what the other 70% were, and I think it's quite likely is because nobody really knew. A very significant proportion of them might well have been hepatitis B, but they weren't measuring. They weren't able to assess. They weren't able to do the analysis.
Well, that's what surprised me when I saw the 30% figure. And plainly, it was related to post-transfusion hepatitis, and so alcohol wouldn't be a cause of that. It may, no doubt, bring to life something which was created by the post-transfusion, but there was an attribution to the transfusion in this.
Exactly, and of course, what one did find with all of this is that if there was any element of pre-existing liver disease, then a further insult, if you like, a further onslaught caused by infection might well make overt hepatitis more likely. But I suspect, I don't know, that the 30% was demonstrably known to be hepatitis B because there was a way of determining the fact that it was hepatitis B, and the other 70%, a significant proportion, might well have been hepatitis B, but it was not detected or detectable.
The article was going on to say, well, now we've reduced it perhaps to about 10%.
That's right.
Leaving 90% for something or something else.
And it was, I think, beginning to be considered that the something or something else, the virus or viruses, which couldn't be characterized as hepatitis A and they couldn't be characterized as hepatitis B, were this something else which was non-A, non-B.
Yes, thank you very much. We'll come back at, we're looking at the time, 2:05.
Thank you, sir.